So I'm really glad to have you on the show. And I have to say, I am wearing a rash guard in honor of having you
Nice,
here. Yeah,
nice.
it's my brand new one. It was gifted to me because I just recently started my own little jiu-jitsu journey. I'm very early in that journey, actually.
Well, very cool.
Uh, yeah,
Congratulations.
thank you. I am probably the last person anybody would ever expect to do jujitsu.
Hmm.
It represents every single discomfort and fear of mine.
Hmm.
So, pretty much touching people,
Hmm.
uh, rolling,
Hmm.
being physical, violent,
Hmm.
everything.
All
And
of
yet
that's going
here
to
I
make it
am.
even better for you.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Well, my first experience was I was just, well, first of all, I couldn't understand a thing, and they just throw you into it. I think if you start as a child, it's rather different, and
Hmm.
as an adult, you come into it and you're uh, just thrown in, and you don't understand a thing, and you're just trying to breathe. And at some point, it just changes, but it's also really fun. I've never had quite that height. I tried to do different sports, and I've never achieved that height of intensity, that euphoric feeling ever before.
Hmm.
And I achieve it pretty much every time I've gone to jiu-jitsu. I've had to take a little break because I had a fracture rib.
Okay.
Very, yeah. So now I'm like in that state of fear of going back. Um, but hopefully I'll overcome that.
It's addictive. Injuries are a nature, just a natural, unfortunately, nature of the process, but you always come back stronger than you were before. There's no doubt about that.
Well, you're the first person who in Oregon to receive the black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Can
Mhm.
you give me a little bit of your background in Jiu-Jitsu, in your journey in Jiu-Jitsu, and what drew you in the first place?
Sure. I was always obsessed with martial arts when I was a kid. And my particular interest in martial arts was what works and what doesn't work in an actual fight. I'd been bullied a little bit when I was a kid. I was kind of a skinny, bookish kid. Been in a few fights. Really wanted to know like what styles work, what doesn't. I had a even intuitive feeling, even as a young boy, that so much of it was bullshit, which it is. And so when I left the military, I started boxing. I had come to the conclusion that boxing is what works for, or kickboxing, some form of that kind of delivery system is what works for standing. But I'd also been in a few fights where people had grabbed me and held me on the ground and put me in a headlock and punched me, and which is kind of the standard fight you get in when you're in a kid in school. I think all boys and probably even a lot of girls have been in fights in school. You get caught in a headlock. And I knew I didn't know anything about the ground. I became an instructor in an art called Jeet No Concepts, which for me was primarily teaching kickboxing. And I was boxing at a pro-am boxing gym in Portland, Oregon, that I had moved to after I left the Army in my very early 20s. I think it was 22. And right about that time, I saw one of my friends who was another boxer brought in an advertisement from a newspaper, a local newspaper. It was before the internet, where this guy was offering to pay people $50 if you could come beat him up. And I thought, I'm getting beat up every day at the boxing gym, and they're not paying me anything for that. In fact, I'm paying like $5 a month to get beat up. So I'll do it. So we showed up, and there was a older, unassuming, much smaller than I am Brazilian man by the name of Fabio Santos. And I would guess at the time he was probably 39, maybe even 40. And I was 22, 23, 240, 250 pounds. And I'd been boxing for a while. And he said, put gloves on and try and beat me up. And the results were, I don't know if you've ever seen the first couple of UFCs, but the results were like that, where I would throw a couple punches. He would body lock, trip me, take me down to the ground, mount, strike. I would roll. He would finish me with a rear naked choke and basically effortlessly controlled and beat me.
Wow.
And I was amazed. I was immediately in love with it. I realized that this is what I was looking for. This was the missing piece that I needed in addition to being able to punch and kick. And so I started training with Fabio. He became a coach for me, and I took a few private lessons with him. And then, unfortunately, he moved. So he hadn't even been teaching jiu-jitsu. He'd been building surfboards up here in Oregon. And Horian Gracie, who was kind of the family patriarch of the Gracie family, was about to create and launch the first ever UFC. And he knew, because they'd been running this repeated experiment in Brazil for decades, that they were going to win. And he knew that they were going to have a huge influx of students, and he needed bodies to come down and coach. So he offered Fabio a job, and he was a little bit vague about the job, but he said, Fabio, I'm going to have you come down here to Southern California. I've got a job for you. You're going to teach jiu-jitsu, get in shape. And so Fabio's way of getting in shape was to put an ad in the newspaper and have people try and beat him up. And so I trained with him a little bit.
Wow.
I fell in love with it. I remember Fabio telling me on my last lesson with him, I remember him saying to me that I've caught the jiu-jitsu bug, and now I'm never going to be able to get rid of it. And he was right. And then he moved. And around the same time he moved, I had the privilege of meeting Rickson Gracie, who is the family champion. Rickson was young, strong. I don't know if you know who Royce Gracie is, who won the first UFC, but Royce was kind of a skinny, unassuming Brazilian kid that didn't look like much. And Royce, or Rickson rather, looks like a carnivore. He looks like a fighter. He's a strong man and was light years ahead of anybody else in the jiu-jitsu community at the time. He's the Michael Jordan of what we do. And I met him, and the first time I met him, I went down to see him teach a class. And when I walked in, he was sitting in the middle of the mat, and he was wrestling one guy after another. And these were big judo black belts, which kind of intimidated me a little bit because I was a striker, but I knew that these guys were tough on the ground. And as I was watching him beat them effortlessly over and over again, making them tap, making them submit, I realized about halfway through that he wasn't using his hands. He'd had his hands in his belt, and he was just beating them by using his legs, believe it or not. And then when he called me out, I was last. He said, for you, my big friend, I'm going to pull out my arm. He didn't need it, but he did pull one arm out. And I jumped on him, and 90 seconds later, he was arm locking me. And I realized there was absolutely nothing I could do to prevent him from breaking my arm. So I tapped. Again, amazed, loved it. I thought this was magic. This is everything I was looking for. I liked him. He liked me. And that was it. And I went back to the school I was teaching at, and I tried to explain to the guys what had just happened to me and what, my revelation. And they weren't into it. They still had these misconceptions about fighting that, they'll never be able to take me down. How are they going to get close to me? You don't want to be in a fight on the ground. So why would you do that? Just blah, blah, blah. And so I realized for me to continue training this, which I had to do, it's like a categorical imperative for me. I am going to do this. I have to have training partners. And so I opened up a little school with a friend of mine who was a judo black belt. And the only reason I opened up the school was to have people that I could have as training partners. I didn't even really want to teach. And when I did that, everybody in the martial arts community that were my peers told me, this is never going to work. People don't want to do that. People want certificates. They don't want to sweat. They don't want to get beat up. You're never going to make any money. I was a young father at the time. My wife was pregnant with our second child. And I thought, okay, well, then I'm not going to make any money at this. This will just be a hobby, but I can't teach bullshit. And so this is what I'm going to do. And fortunately, turned out there was a whole bunch of people that wanted to train like I did. And just because I happened to be the first in Oregon to kind of open up a school like this, I just started to get a flood of people. And my organization just kind of grew from there. And that was in about 1992, 1993. So 32 years ago. And we've been going strong ever since. Now I have
And you've trained.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, you've trained some pretty significant people.
Yeah, I have my gym in Oregon, which has grown to, we have 700 and some odd students here in Portland. And then my organization spread as well. I put out a series of videos in the late 90s called Aliveness, where I talked about why some martial arts work and why some martial arts don't work. And that brought a lot of people to me as well because they felt like I did, but nobody else had said it out loud. And that they became part of my organization called SBG, and they spread around the world. And so now we have about 70 locations, of which about 20 are big commercial schools like mine. And we have quite a few professional fighters and jiu-jitsu champions. Our most famous is probably Conor McGregor from Ireland, but we are Ireland SBG, but we've also have a bunch of fighters from Chris Conley and Adam Singer. And yeah, so, we have an enormous fight team and jiu-jitsu athletes, but to this day, 99.8% of everybody I teach and that walks through my door is just an everyday person. Ages range from 5 years old to in their 70s. One of my coaches, one of my black belts here, teaches at my gym, is in his 70s. And I have another female black belt named Lily that runs our Berkeley location, who started training with me when she was 52. She's now in her 70s. She runs a school. So it's for all ages. And most people sign up not because they want to fight in a cage or because even necessarily do jiu-jitsu tournaments, although some of them gravitate towards that to test themselves. The vast majority of people sign up because they want to learn how to defend themselves and get in shape at the same time. And then
So that,
they come in here and they realize it's fun, kind of like you've
yeah.
experienced, and then they're hooked.
Well, that's interesting because actually, so there is a woman in the gym I attend. She started when she was in also I think around 55 or so. She just got her purple belt. She's in her late 60s, I believe. She's tiny woman,
Mm-hmm.
and she's been sort of mentoring me quite a bit. And she's what I love about her, she knows that by physically she can't do much, but people like to work with her because of the technique. She's good at technique. She's good at her husband is particularly good. He's also been working with me, and he's very philosophical about it, and he barely moves, and he's in this relaxed state. So he's been trying to relay that to me, and that's what got me hooked. I think for me, I was not interested at all in the self-defense side. I mean, really, it's our mutual friend who's been harping on me to do it in the first place. But for me, I wasn't really interested in self-defense because I didn't think I would really find myself in a situation where I would need it, or that where I would practically really, where it would be that useful or I'd be good at it. Uh, or I thought there'd be other techniques I could use for it. However, when I started doing it, I felt that it was something akin to a chess game.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that, discovered that within myself, there was this not violence so much as there was a competitiveness for sure. And there was this kind of need to a fight, that I wasn't aware that I had in me, that I was willing to kind of keep going, not give up. The sort of the slogan of tap often when needed, but never out of exhaustion. I'm probably misquoting it.
Yes, no, that's important.
Yeah, and I never tapped out of exhaustion. And I'm a lazy person, and I'm somebody who is prone to giving up. So that is my character in some ways. But I'm also sort of determined.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been kind of an interesting experience to sort of discover things about myself that I wasn't aware of. And I
Mm-hmm.
do find it fun because I've only recently realized, oh, I am a kind of a competitive person. So that is something that's interesting. And then this, as you kind of get into it and you start understanding it more, and you're not just trying to survive, and there's this clarity of mind that
Mm-hmm.
comes in. And the more you have that clarity of mind, the more you're able to think steps ahead, and And in the beginning, I was just struggling to breathe, to stay in and to survive, to fight back. But then it's like you become calm, and it
Mm-hmm.
seems almost counterproductive as you're fighting someone, but it's not,
No.
right?
Yeah, no, 100%. Jiu-jitsu kind of thrusts upon you after a while, after you become a little more comfortable and you start rolling in a competitive way. It kind of puts you in it's an easy entrance into that kind of zone state, because if you're consciously thinking and if you're focused on the subvocalization in your brain during the roll, you're going to be too slow. And so your body just starts to relax, and you just sort of kind of establish this physical relationship with your opponent where everything is done by feel, and you kind of forget about all those neurotic thoughts that most of us have most of the time. And that's a really enjoyable process. I think
Meditative.
meditative process. It's part of what I think people find so addictive about it, for sure. And we all have within us, one of the points that I try and make in my book is we all have within us those instincts for violence, whether we know it or not, because of our ancestors. I mean, you come from an unbroken chain of success. Every one of your ancestors was able to live long enough to procreate and have their ancestors procreate, which is an incredibly rare and an incredibly amazing track record of success. And a good reason why they were able to do that is because they have all these instincts, and many of them have defended themselves in violent situations. Many of them have killed. Many of them have done what's necessary for you to be here today. And all of that is embedded in you. And in the modern world that we live in, especially since things over long-term trends, things have gotten better. I mean, we're in kind of a short-term spike of violence right now. But if we look big picture, every generation we go back, it gets a little bit worse in terms of violence. And so the downside to that is we kind of get out of touch with what I like to prefer to call primal instincts. And jujitsu is a perfect way, a healthy way for you to establish a relationship with that part of yourself. And I think that's important too. I think that helps people be happy. And I think you want to establish that relationship to that part of yourself before you're forced to establish that relationship in a way that might not be productive, in a way that would be shocking because it's just thrust upon you.
Well, that's a big part of your book is how society has turned off sort of our natural affinity for violence and aggression, something that we often are taught to think of as negative things, and and often they are. We have sort of this passiveness and this fear of aggression that has kind of overcome us. Uh, but it also can have negative consequences for our society. Can you perhaps elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think, one of the first, actually, the first sentence of my book, and it's very intentionally the first sentence, is that violence is natural and it's intrinsic to our existence. It's intrinsic in a way that I think very few things are. The only other thing that I think could compare close to it would be sex and procreation. It's that core to who we are as animals. And like sex and like issues that run that deep inside us, I think people often take one of two extremes where they'll glamorize or romanticize the act itself, which is not healthy, and that kind of a reflection of an immature attitude towards it that can almost manifest itself in negative ways in a person's life. And on the other end of the extreme, you have people who demonize and repress those instincts as if there's something wrong with them, and that also can really be dangerous. That head in the sand approach. It's also not moral, because all you end up doing is passing along responsibility for your personal safety to somebody else who eventually is going to have to do it, because there's nothing valuable or moral about allowing another person to put their hands on you and hurt you, or someone else that you love. And so finding a balance between the pacifists that are demonizing the act itself in a way that I think is silly, and what I call boys speak, but the people who romanticize and glorify violence, somewhere in the middle there is a healthy approach, a healthy relationship to the topic. And since I think all of us as human beings, one way or another, have to have a relationship to the topic of violence, we are going to, at some point in our life, be forced to acknowledge that we have a relationship with this subject, with rare exception, that you want that relationship to be a healthy one. And to be a healthy one is to understand how to navigate between those two extremes and see it exactly for what it is, and see it for the positive nature of what can be done and why it's necessary. We live in a world where there are now and will always be people who, when they see someone vulnerable and incapable, or what they perceive as being incapable of defending themselves in the given moment, will rape and torture that person. They have always existed, and they're not going away. And being able to manage that without turning it into a fetish, or without demonizing it and turning it into some kind of moral failing, I think is super helpful. I think it helps create better people. You know, one of the sayings that we have from my friend Paul Sharp, that we talk about SBG, is one of our goals is to try and make good people more dangerous to bad people. And
That's what I was going to bring up.
yeah,
Yeah.
I like that saying a lot. And one of the nice side benefits that I've learned over the years, and I think we all have over the years of doing that and engaging in that, is making good people more dangerous to bad people. It doesn't just make people safer, it also makes better people. It makes people who are more comfortable and confident and capable of kindness and being loving and open in the appropriate circumstance. So I think it's a win-win.
I guess it's also that idea that if you have the threat of violence, right? Because if you know, if that, bad guy, that bad person thinks that they can get away with it, they're going to do that bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of the idea of, nuclear weapons, right? If everybody has nuclear weapons, you don't want to use them. And if you know that the other person on the other side can protect themselves and inflict damage onto you, you're going to be way less likely to engage in that fight, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all animal predators, including the human animal, are lazy. They look for the weakest target. I mean, lions aren't going to attack the fastest, strongest looking gazelle. They're going to go for the weak one. And it's one of those situations like it. If you have, for example, we'll talk about a horrible situation, but let's say you have a school shooter and you have a teacher who just locks the door. It's very important for teachers to be able to lock their door from the inside for those kind of situations. The only thing we're going to really be able to do to minimize and control school shootings is to minimize access, which is really what it's all about. When you want to control and secure a situation, you have to control access. And so if you have one teacher that just locks the door, yes, they could break through the glass. Yes, they might be able to kick the door down. But you know what? 9 times out of 10, they're going to be walking through the hall. They're going to check that door. It's going to be locked. They're going to go to the next door. And the door that's unlocked, that's where they're going to go in and start shooting all the kids. And we've seen this time and time again. It's part of what we see with what's called broken window policing. But half a fence is better than no fence. Creating barriers to access, making it just a little bit more difficult for predators, let alone much more difficult. Carrying yourself in a way that appears, you don't have to be a big man like myself. You could be smaller, you could be petite, but if you look like somebody who's going to put up a fight, if you look like somebody who's going to be a struggle, if you look like somebody who knows where they're going and carries themselves in a way where you can sense that they're going to be assertive, the odds of you getting checked off that predator shopping list that day go dramatically up. And so even just training in jiu-jitsu the way you are now will affect the way you carry yourself everyday life. And that makes it even less likely that they will pick you. And those kind of predators, violent criminal actors, they're real good at profiling. We've done study after study where they can, within a fraction of a second, they can look at people walking across the street, and to a person, when they've done these studies in prison, they'll pick the same people with like 80-90% accuracy. So they'll rate, like you'll see people walking across the street from the head up, or from the head down rather. And they'll ask the criminals, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely would you be to attack that particular subject? And they'll find a consensus that as high as 80, 90% between these guys. And they're just watching just a couple seconds of how the person walks. And it has to do with how they carry themselves, just how they walk, how they carry themselves, the kind of assertiveness they carry themselves. If they have kind of a limp, or if they look unsure, if they're walking with their arms close by their side, like they're tentative or not sure where they're going, or shy, all those things make you more of a target.
That's really fascinating because I've always thought about this. I when I'm sort of downtown in certain neighborhoods, I actually never get picked on or never get asked for money. And I thought, is it my resting bitch face? But when I kind of analyze it too, I'm very aware of my surroundings. And I also have this mental preparedness, of what I'll say if somebody approaches me, of how to behave. And I think maybe there's something to that where just maybe that is reflected in my body language, because I'll have friends of mine and they'll automatically get approached. I even don't get approached in sort of very touristy areas in foreign countries. I'll sort of blend in, and I will kind of consciously figure out how to physically blend into the environment. So there's something about that. And I guess these people, when they target, maybe they don't even think about that very much, but they sort of intuitively know how to pick people out. So that's interesting. And then, the name of your book is The Gift of Violence. Did you always see violence as a gift? And what do you see as most of, a gift about it?
Yeah, what's definitely a intentionally provocative title. I
Yes.
also think that, when I went to write the book, I spent a couple of years reading most of what I found on the market, just because I wanted to make sure I wasn't writing something that somebody had already done better. And out of everything I read, the only book that really spoke to me as being very worthwhile was a book called The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker, which I do recommend in my own book. And so it's kind of a play on both those things. But if you think about it, what better gift can you give somebody than freedom from exploitation by physical means? So teaching somebody how to live their life in a way where they can avoid that kind of exploitation, really is a gift. Really is a gift where you can walk through the world in a way that's in a way that suits you much better, and where you're not constantly walking around in fear. So part of what I wanted to do is be accurate with the data, explain exactly what's going on. I definitely don't want to instill any kind of paranoia in people. It's not the type of thing where there are some scary stories in the book and I talk about some real violent events, but I also talk about the statistical reality of those things. And if you're, the first key, I think, and it comes up in the acronym that I teach in the book, which is MIND, and the first part of that is maturity. And if you focused on the maturity aspect of what I'm talking about in that book, the odds of you ever being engaged in any of these violent confrontations drops off massively. So there's like this, you're just all of a sudden, you're going to cut the odds down by like 90%. And then you start to apply your intelligence, the next part of the MIND acronym. And both an educated awareness of what you should look for, what just doesn't look right, and above all else, not being afraid or ashamed to think the thoughts that you have or the questions that you have, when not being worried about feeling like you're being racist or judgmental when you see a situation and your alarm bells go off. And in conjunction with that are the kind of primal instincts that Gavin de Becker also talks about, which are evolutionary, born from millions of years. And you have, and I have, and everybody has. And where we get in trouble is when we fail to listen to those, we start rationalizing those away, often for somewhat noble reasons. We don't want to appear judgmental. We don't want to think that of people. But the more you're rationalizing away these kind of concerns, the more concerned you should be about that particular circumstance. So if you learn to pay attention to what your brain is telling you, your brain and body is telling you, and you educate yourself a little bit on some simple things that you can look for, now again, we knock down the odds of you ever coming in that situation dramatically. And then we just get to N, which is situational awareness and knowing very specific things to look for, pre-incident indicators. They don't take long to teach, so that you can go through the world with clear eyes about what should concern you and what you don't necessarily need to worry about. And what we're trying to do there is modify that signal to noise ratio, because if you're paranoid, that's a lot of noise. And if you're, that's the opposite of what I'm talking about. The lack of paranoia, but just a really smart ability to listen to your own internal voice, means that signal is going to be very strong and it's going to stand out. And you're going to notice that signal. And then you can create space. And creating space between you and the threat is the key to managing every physical conflict. And last but not least, so all these things, notice none of them have to do with physical fighting, right? None of them have to do with physical conflict. All these things, now we get to the D, which is about deterrence, distance management, and then if it comes down to it, determination. And deterrence is how you carry yourself. It's a consequence of naturally carrying yourself. Some of the things we talked about, getting yourself unselected off that predator list. Distance management is the key to all physical combat. If you can control the space between you and your opponent in a cage, in a self-defense situation, in a military situation, anti-terrorist situation, anytime violence is involved, if you can control the distance, you can control the encounter. If you can control the space, you can control the fight. And so that's what everything we do physical is really all about, being able to control the space between you and the other body. And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is particularly good at that. That's what it's all about. And if you think about it, if you're in a situation where you're not able to run away to make space, which is what you should be doing, right? That means the other person's hanging on to you. They've grabbed you. And that's where jiu-jitsu is. That's where you're going to be at home. That's what you feel on the mat. It's not going to be a surprise to you when somebody puts their hands on you, because people put their hands on you every day at the gym. And you're going to be at a home there. And last but not least, all that happens, you just have to be determined and sure that at the end of the day, you're the one that's going to go home to your family, because you're fighting then out of love for yourself and your loved ones and the people that you want to go home safely to. And in most cases, they're fighting for something else, something they felt they could target you for. And in that sense, you also have the advantage. And determination is also something you develop every day you show up to training. I mean, learning to become comfortable in uncomfortable situations is such an important part of jiu-jitsu. Learning not to give up, to hold out, and how many times, you'll have some terrible roll and then you're getting crushed and you've got some huge guy smashing your face and you're thinking to yourself, why am I doing this? I could be home watching Netflix. This sucks. And then you find a place to breathe and you barely escape, and then maybe you get a sweep and now you're on top, and lo and behold, you either get up or you manage to win. And that's huge. That's just a normal everyday thing that happens in class, but that is a huge thing for you. And you replicate that time after time after time, week after week, when you come into the gym, and you're developing a level of determination that the average dumb street thug is just not going to have anything. He's not going to have anything like that. And
Well,
so
my first,
that
oh no,
combination is all you need.
yeah, no, my first time I audited at a different gym, and I just had a giant person on top of me, so huge that it was intentional. And
Yeah.
and it was like there was no way for me to even move. I was supposed to flip somehow, and I had no idea how to even move, and I couldn't breathe at all. And I felt myself, and I definitely went into a panic mode because I couldn't even breathe. But there was a lesson in that, and it was interesting. And then later on, I had I rolled with another giant person, but now I had some skill
Mm-hmm.
in I might have had slightly more, I'm not sure, but I'm very small compared to that person.
Sure.
And he, and he didn't know to restrain at all. So it was interesting. But then I found openings, and yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
did feel that those moments of some pride, because I was going up against somebody so much larger than me. But
Yep.
also what you were saying about just trusting your instincts. Because I always thought I was this very neurotic person that couldn't deal with these kinds of situations. And I was shooting a TV show, a spy show in Morocco. And we did have some crazy situations, but one of which, I had a guy started talking to me, and he was trying to practice his English. So I talked to him, and then I had a gut feeling something was off. Like, I couldn't quite tell, but there was a different sound.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I'm sorry, I think and I looked around, and it seemed like everyone was gone. And I said, and instead of, I said, I'm so sorry, I have to go. And I kind of ran and found my group, and my gut was right. There was a machete fight that broke out right there. And then later there were these guys that chased our digital team out. They were gonna attack them. They weren't gonna let them leave. And then we had a near riot, and it was weird, the calmness with which I would make decisions, though.
Mm-hmm.
I would just kind of go, okay, this is the situation that's happening. What is my next step? And I would just kind of move from step to step in this very rational, calm way. And I didn't expect that of myself. But a lot of it was also just listening to my gut and not just staying polite, which is
Right.
generally my default. And that's
Sure.
what you were also talking about. A lot of times people get trapped into these, oh, I'm going to come across like I'm racist, or I'm not impolite or whatnot. But you have to sort of trust your gut. And there were certain situations where I encountered people where my gut said, this person is okay, and I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
trust my gut, and I'm going to accept this offer to have tea with this person, because
Mm-hmm.
I have a feeling that this person means well, and I accepted it, and I had a good experience. And other times where I felt in my gut that something was off, and I was okay to be a little bit rude, in order to sort of get away from that situation. But that is something that often gets us in trouble. And it's something that I think probably gets us in trouble a lot. And
Mm-hmm.
it's very social,
Mm-hmm.
um, because we're taught, this is how we shouldn't behave.
Mm-hmm. No,
I know
that's
you talk
100%
about
true.
that a lot.
Yeah, yeah, that can't be stated enough. I mean, people really need to understand how to trust their instincts. There's been more than a few situations where things have turned violent or there's been a confrontation, and I have noticed myself before I even saw what the conflict was about, or even the person I was going to be engaged in the conflict with, I could start to feel a sense of fight or flight response, and I can start to feel my adrenaline going. And if I didn't know better, you would chalk that up to some sort of extrasensory perception or something. But it's just our instincts and all the millions of different things, I feel that we take in from our environment that we're not consciously aware of are there. And it's so important to trust those. And you know what? I try and remind people in the book, if you're wrong, and you wind up misjudging somebody, if the person is a decent man, I'm a big person. I'm 6'8", whatever, 200 and 60 pounds or something. And if I'm in an elevator and I see that there's an older woman or a woman or something like that, I can tell she's nervous from my presence. Doesn't make me angry. If anything, it makes me a little bit of embarrassed, and I'm going to try and play that down to make her comfortable, maybe take another
Mm.
elevator. I don't think there's anything special about me. I just think that's what a normal man would do. If on the other side of that, I start faking insult, and start playing on those emotions that I can feel from her, then that's a dead set sign that I'm not a good person. And it's so important to listen to that.
Well, I
Every one
had
of
that
those.
exact situation actually in New York. I was walking to the subway, and I felt uncomfortable. I saw this man. He wasn't huge, but something in me just said something is weird. And he saw me kind of walk away, and he said, "Oh, don't walk away. I'm not going to hurt you." Which seems like a surefire sign. I'm a nice guy, something like that. And
100%.
okay,
Nice guy's not going to say that. He's not going to be angry. He's going to be embarrassed.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I've seen that over and over again, and that is a huge part of the book. Gavin DeBecker has written quite a bit about that, but that's what I call the intelligence and noticing part of that mind formula. And that's something anybody can learn, and that's something you can pay attention to. I also think that those instincts and those ideas are also heightened by, I hate to to keep going back to the same point, but by being involved in combat sport, especially Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it helps you become more confident with who you are, which allows you to pay more attention to those kind of thoughts and feelings that arise in your brain, and that's what's going to keep you safe more than anything else.
Well, one thing that we've already touched on this a little bit, that you said that people, everyone kind of has a violent aspect to them. But it does seem that some people connect to that violent side to them more than others. And
Mm-hmm.
so, why do you think that is?
I think it just has to do with, well, I think a lot of it will have to do with how you're raised, how much violence you were exposed to or not exposed to as a child, as well as what you're responsible for. So when I've taught, for example, self-defense clinics for women, sometimes inexperienced women who have not trained, not jujitsu trainers or athletes, but just everyday people, one of the things that they'll often say is, so I've yet to be able to figure out how to turn that off of my keep it bleeping off my laptop. I'm technologically disinclined that way. I'm going to put it on silent here real quick and see if that helps. Um, but one of the things I've heard often is they'll say, I don't think I could, we'll talk about some kind of situation where you're dealing with some bad guy who maybe is trying to pull you into a car or something. I don't know if I could do that. I don't know if I could hurt somebody. I don't know if I could have it in me to hurt somebody, and I know they mean that. That's what they feel because it's such a foreign thing for them, and they're being sincere. And my first question to them is, are you a mom? Some of them are, and some of them aren't. And I say, okay, what if that was your child? That was to say
Mm,
you're walking with your 3 or 4 year old and they're starting to pull the 3 or 4 year old in the car or do something like that. What would you do then? And then immediately it becomes really gruesome about what they would do to that other person. Nothing is worse than a mom whose child is getting attacked. And
yeah.
it's like, well, okay, that child is going to be without a mom if you don't turn that on. Think of your child in that circumstance. Think about what you love and who you have to go back to and who you're responsible for. And I think that helps people to understand that, yes, actually, you really are capable of that. If push comes to
I
shove, you're
struggled with
fully
that
capable of it.
when I first went to jujitsu. I think people assumed that I was afraid of being injured, and actually, I didn't seem to have that fear. The fear I had is actually hurting other people. So
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting that I would think that I could hurt other people with my lack of jujitsu skills, but that was my fear. I really was afraid of injuring somebody else, but I wasn't really afraid for myself. And it took me a while to be able to be okay, like putting my hands on somebody else, and I'm careful, but I was that was the difficulty for me. So I think it's
Mm-hmm.
something that's common for people who haven't had that experience. Like I said, I had a hard time even touching someone, let alone then inflicting some measure of pain on them potentially. So that's understandable, but you're right, bringing that up in that way of, like, mothers certainly get very protective, but that is a challenge, and I don't know if we do it if sometimes we have a hard time maybe caring enough about ourselves, or if we have doubts, if we're like, oh, I don't know if this person is really going to do this thing. And in the moment when you're not prepared, when you don't have that practice, it's harder, I think.
For sure. And how do you feel about that now that you've trained a little bit more?
I think it would be much easier. I think I would
Mm-hmm.
have less hesitation. I do.
Mm-hmm.
I think, although I think a lot of the techniques that I've learned are in, I think I would need them in close proximity in specific situations, but I'm new to it.
Mm-hmm.
There's some things that I would feel a little more. Uh, I would definitely feel more comfortable, in
Mm-hmm.
that situation. I think more confident, like you said, decisive, I think is the key word. So I
Mm-hmm.
think in that context, I would. I hope I would never have to face that kind of situation,
Sure,
but
sure.
I definitely felt as I was walking around just a little more confident in that way.
Yeah.
Um, like knowing that I could mentally be a little more. I think I would just even being able to slow down things so that
Mm-hmm.
I'm not reacting in this heightened emotional state where I'm scared, but more of a calm state where I can sort of plan my moves. I think that would even help a lot. But as everyone sort of told me in terms of my coaches, they said, the key is really figure out how to get away.
Mm-hmm.
So you use the techniques to try to get away. So if you have to do something to really, you want to create distance
Right.
ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Want to avoid the fight because ultimately I am still smaller. And if it's, I'm probably going to be attacked by men, not somebody my size.
Right.
So I want to get away. Um,
Yeah.
but it will
And
help.
nothing helps you get away better than jujitsu, because if you can't get away, they're grabbing you, right?
Yeah.
They're holding on to you.
Yeah.
So, but I think that's proof positive that just more and more training will help you overcome that, what is in many ways a nice instinct. It's like you don't want to hurt people. I totally get it. That's a good thing. But just the fact that you're stepping on the mat over and over again and you're confronting those situations in a physical way, in a healthy way, and then you start to overcome that a little bit. That combined with, I just think some people have a certain level of naivete about the kind of horrible people that exist in our world. If you're not a police officer who drives around all the time and is aware of the types of humans that are in every single community, um, and for good reason, because who wants to focus on that kind of stuff? But I think that there is a place for realizing what other human beings can be capable of. That's one of the only reasons I told that really awful story about the Pettit family in my book, because it's such a horrendous story where he lit the young girls on fire while they were alive. But I wanted people to understand that it's incredibly rare, right? So it's like getting struck by lightning, that particular situation, but it does happen, and those people are out there. And I mentioned there's another story in my book I talk about where a woman came to me a few years ago who was in a wheelchair. And when she came I had her come to the gym just to kind of evaluate what I felt I could hopefully do for her. And she told me, when I interviewed her, it'd been like within the last few months, she'd been groped like half a dozen times where people had actually pushed her over in her wheelchair here in Oregon and tried to, molest her and rape her. And as she was going through these awful stories, the first thing in my mind was, that's a lot for such a short period of time in Portland, which a few years ago wasn't nearly as bad. It hasn't evolved to the place that it is
Yeah.
now. I mean, statistically, it seems unlikely, but then it immediately dawned on me that she's just the perfect target. So she's a magnet for those kind of people. And there exists in our world people, they're out there right now walking around in my city, where if they see a child by themselves or a woman in a wheelchair by herself, or anybody that's super vulnerable and there's no witnesses around, they're going to act to rape or torture or hurt that person. That's who they are. That's what they are. They exist. And um, just the understanding that those people are there, I think sometimes people need to wrap their mind around that, because it's such a foreign thing for people who've never
Yeah, no,
lived
I
around
agree.
that.
I agree. I've never, unfortunately, I've never been naive. Maybe fortunately as well, but I've never been naive about that. Um,
Yeah.
something that you talk about a lot, and you know, for is aliveness. So
Mhm.
I'd love for you to just give us a little bit of a definition of that, but also explain how you can apply that outside of jiu-jitsu when it comes to a regular person who's not engaging in fights. Is it possible? How is it possible to keep this concept of aliveness while, not practicing in a more direct way? Because I think that might relate a little bit in the real
Okay.
world as well. Yeah.
Yeah, aliveness was, I mentioned that obsession I had when I was growing up about martial arts, like what works in a martial art and what doesn't work in a martial art. And the kind of questions that come up are like, does Wing Chun work or Taekwondo work? Or what about boxing? And people think of it in terms of style versus style. And I came to realize over a few years of training that every martial art that works, what I would call a functional martial art, all have one thing in common. And the one thing they have in common is they're a combat sport. So if we look, for example, at the arts that are used in the UFC, you're going to have boxing and kickboxing, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, wrestling, all kinds of forms of wrestling, judo, sambo. Those are the arts. Well, what do all those arts have in common? They're all sports. And why is it that sports work and most of the other, for lack of a better term, traditional martial arts that don't have those kind of sporting applications don't work? In fact, I'd go so far as to say they're bullshit. They're superstition in many ways. And the reason is the training method. The training method I call aliveness. So they're the opponent process. You learn the fundamentals of the mechanical movements, the best practices to deal with a particular movement. And I view those things as puzzles, all of which that'll admit to a physical solution. They're objective questions, not subjective questions. And once you have those technical answers, then you have to train it with timing, energy, and motion. You have to train it not in a rehearsed pattern, what they would call a kata or a form in martial art, but with an element of failure. Failure is an essential part of the process. So you learn the best practice. For example, you learn the best practice to escape from a headlock. And you demonstrate the move 4 or 5 times so the instructor can look and see that you know how to do it physically correct without anybody resisting against you. And in most cases, that doesn't take long. I could teach that to you in 10 or 15 minutes. And once that happens, now we have somebody put you in a headlock. And we'll adjust the intensity, right? They may not like squeeze you 100% right away, but they're going to really hold you, and you're really going to try and escape. And sometimes you're going to fail, and sometimes you're not. And as your level of success goes up, we dial up the pressure a little bit, and they make it a little harder and a little harder. And then again, sometimes you fail, and sometimes you don't. And that failure is just not okay. It's not just okay. It's essential. And eventually we dial it up more and more. And in those rounds where you're actually trying to escape and the other person's actually trying to hold you down, your body develops timing. And that timing transcends environment. That timing is what's going to come out in you if you go out in the street in a parking lot and some guy grabs your head and takes you down to the ground and tries to punch you or do something bad to you. That's what's going to kick in, and that's going to help you escape that particular situation. And that's called aliveness. It's a live training, and it's an opponent process. And anytime in the world where we have something where results matter, where we care about the results, then we as human beings go to some form of meritocratic competition. We go to some form of opponent process. What is science if not an opponent process? You come up with a hypothesis, and then you go to qualified people who do their best to tear down the hypothesis when it's working correctly, when it's not corrupted, right? And it's a ruthless form of competition, and may the best hypothesis win. And that's how the scientific process works. That's how sports work. That's how um, everything that we care about, when we care about the end result, that's what we rely on. And when you take that opponent process out, when you remove the aliveness, what you're left with is dead patterns, repetition of a dead pattern. Like you could grab a dummy, a stuffed dummy, and pretend to do 200 arm bars on the right side of the stuffed dummy and 200 arm bars on the left side of the stuffed dummy. But 6 years later, your arm bars aren't going to be any better. And I use a simple analogy of teaching my wife my daughter badminton. When I taught her badminton, I hit the ball at her or bird at her real light, and she misses. And then I do it again light, and she misses. I do it again, she hits it back. Do it again, she hits it back. I do it again, she hits it back. I hit it back to her. We back up a little bit. I hit it a little harder. The process goes on, and after 30 minutes or a half hour, she and I are playing badminton. Whereas in traditional martial arts, usually what they do is, you can imagine, they have her pretending to hold a racket in a studio somewhere, and then they're saying, oh, your right knee needs to be pointed inward a little bit and your left elbow's too far down. And you imagine hitting the bird over and over again for 6 years, and then eventually will work from this kata, the secret movement, and to an alive drill. And they never actually do it and move on to the alive process, because when you do, then the whole thing falls apart, because you realize that the movements you were learning don't actually work. And so that's the difference between a live martial art and a functional martial art. And the one thing that every functional martial art has in common is that principle of aliveness. It's a training method. It's epistemology that matters. So it's how you arrive at the answer, not the answer itself. Same thing as critical thinking. And the nice thing about martial arts is the problems that we're dealing with when we talk about the physical aspect of it are objective questions. How to escape when somebody's holding you down in a headlock. How to escape if somebody's sitting on your chest and punching you in the face. How to escape if somebody's on your back trying to choke you. How to escape if somebody's grabbed your arm. There are good, better, best ways to do that, more efficient ways for a smaller, weaker person to do it against somebody bigger and stronger. We seek out those methods, and then we drill in an alive manner. And it's that drill time when you're doing it alive where you actually gain skill. And as simple as that is, and as obvious as that is, that's what's absent from every other, what I call fantasy-based martial art, like Aikido. Aikido looks super cool. It's pretty, and it can look cool in the movies. Some of Steven Seagal's movies look kind of cool. But the guy who's getting thrown it's just choreography. And the guy who's getting thrown is really the one that's doing the technique. And the other guy is just pretending. And if instead you replace that guy who's taking a fall, the uke who's taking a fall for the demonstrator, with a football player, all that's going to happen is that Aikido guy is going to get beat up. And so I ended the book with a chapter on aliveness, so that, because one of my recommendations that's kind of spread throughout the book in not so subtle ways is, I do think everybody should take up some kind of combat sport. I'm obviously partial to jiu-jitsu because I love jiu-jitsu.
Just a little bit. Yeah.
Just a little bit. But, judo, boxing, wrestling, I don't care. You can put your kids in rugby, but just something physical that's real, where they're going to feel this push and pull, then I'm okay with that. And so I ended it with a chapter on aliveness. So anybody that wants to step in and begin training, which I hope they do after reading the book, they'll have an idea of what to look for. And in a very simple way, all I would say to people is, when you're watching a martial arts demonstration, watch the guy who's getting thrown, watch the guy who's getting beat up. Don't watch the guy who's doing the technique, because what you're going to find 9 times out of 10 is somebody kind of like stepping forward and throwing a punch and then freezing. And the other guy does all this magical shit, or he steps forward with some ridiculous motion that nobody would ever do. And then he goes and falls and whatnot. Whereas when we do jiu-jitsu, it's like touch hands and we grab each other. And he's guy's trying not to let me take him down and beat him, and I'm trying not to let him and take me down and beat me, and one of us is going to get it, and we really got it. And so the longer you train in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the more you're going to have those kind of experiences. And not only are you going to learn what you're capable of, which is a lot more than you think you are, But just as importantly, you're also going to learn what you're not capable of. You're not going to have these fantasies in your mind about being able to go beat up 6 football players in a parking lot.
Yeah, I never had those fantasies. So
I
I've
used to have
only
those
learned.
fantasies. That's more of a male thing, but yeah.
Oh no, okay, that's a lie. I have to say, when I watched Batman, I guess it's Batman Returns. I did have Catwoman. Oh, I don't know if I should be admitting it on a live podcast.
I
Oh
get it.
well.
Catwoman was cool, and I could see that.
Well, more than that, I made myself fake nails like Catwoman,
Nice.
and I clawed at trees. This is the part I shouldn't be admitting. This
Okay.
is very embarrassing, but I really, she was a character that I very much admired. So I did dream of kicking, bad guys and all that. So yeah, I guess I did have those fantasies. Don't think I'll be able to do that quite, but I'm progressing. I think I'll be able to do something, and something is better than nothing. So
For sure.
that's all I'm gonna say.
For sure.
I think I'm able to do more than I thought, and at least I think for me, just being able. Look, like I said to you in the beginning, I never thought I'm the last person to be taking jiu-jitsu. I'm germophobic. I was afraid of touching people, can't fight, nothing, out of shape. And then the fact that I even committed to doing it like 3 times a week and coming in, I'm proud of even that. So
Good
hopefully
for you.
I'll gather the strength, the willpower to go back and do it. One thing I will say that I loved is that everyone I rolled with, and especially a lot of the times I was lucky enough to do it with people who are a lot more senior, so more like purple belts, black belts. They each would give me a little nugget of wisdom. So it felt
Mhm.
like they were sharing something, and I would just learn a little bit from their techniques and put it in my toolkit. And it just felt like this tremendous act of generosity. And I felt that was quite unique to jiu-jitsu in a way. Not that I've done many other sports, but there's something about it that just felt kind of special to that.
Yeah, people like to share. And what I try and remind students when we do our belt ceremonies, which we call Ironmans here at the gym, is that it's an individual sport if you go and compete, but it takes a team to create an individual. It takes a whole group of
Mm.
people, and they all share with you, and you have people that you beat, and that's how you develop your offense. And you have people who beat you all the time, and that's how you develop your defense. And you have people that you'll be close to that you're going to have battles with, and that a kind of arms race develops where your game develops. But I have had produced a couple female world champions, and my experience has been actually, I think women learn jujitsu faster than men because they're more coachable.
Oh, really? Well, I've had a lot of. It was nice. Like I felt very guilty in the beginning that these much more experienced people would be stuck with me. That's how I felt about it. And I said, "I'm so sorry, you're stuck with me." And I said, "No, no, this because I learn by teaching, so it's kind of an honor for me to work with you." And
Mm-hmm.
that attitude, I just really appreciate it. And certain people have kind of taken to, going to me and saying, "Hey, Catherine, come." You're with me today, or let's work on this. And so I've really appreciated the specific people who've done that with me, and have kind of taken me under their wing and worked on certain things with me, and really encourage me when I improve, and they see these certain improvements and things like that. So it's feels kind of special in that way, for sure.
It is, and it's nice to see other people. Everybody loves to see other people starting to grow in the art. I think everybody gets a kick out of that. It's nice to
Yeah.
see.
Yeah. Well, one thing about, so kind of going back to the to violence, from this very lovely thing to back to violence.
Yeah.
But violence is a gift, so it seems like a great segue. The wisdom is a gift, and violence is a gift. one thing is like violence is something that we've been having a lot of conversations about in society lately, in particular about, you know, when are forms of violence justified. And, you know, especially feels relevant right now. We have protests that were threatening to turn into riots over the beating, death of Tyre Nichols. And then, you know, we obviously saw massive riots over the death of George Floyd. And, you know, some people believe that line should never be crossed. And at the same time, I've been having conversation with people who say that working with this within the system has failed them. And so violence is really the only way to make real change. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. A very simple question.
Yeah. So there's a chapter on this in my book, which is called "Are the Police a Threat?" And I go into the numbers on this. And I also engaged in an online debate with author Ali Rizvi in the summer of 2020, which was initially on WikiLetters, but people can find it on Collate. So if they look up my name, Matt Thornton, BLM debate, I think the Collate link will come up and they can find it. And so where to begin here? It's let's start with people's perception. You know, there's been some polling done where people have been asked, how many unarmed Black Americans do you think are murdered by police officers every year? And the more progressive somebody identifies themselves as politically, the higher the number they think that is. And it'll range some incredible number. I have it in my book. I don't want to quote it directly, but 40 to 60% believed it was somewhere between 1,000 to 10,000 American unarmed Black Americans killed every year by police. And it goes down from there to, I think the lowest the progressive believed were, you know, 200 to 300 per year. The actual number, and this has been pretty consistent for the last decade, is about 12. So there's about 12 unarmed Black suspects that are killed every year in America by police. Now, this is out of hundreds of millions of contacts that the police have every year. The police in our country have contacts every year. They have hundreds of thousands of interactions, thousands and thousands of arrests, shootings, getting shot at, and unarmed, you have about 12. And there's so few that you can check them number by number. This is very same as the cases that BLM puts forward. There's not many. I mean, there's usually about a dozen to 15. So you can go by, anybody can take the time to read each case themselves. And when you read those 12 cases, you'll find that what the Washington Post database, which is the one I often use for shootings, there's the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the FBI, and the Washington Post database. All three are pretty similar, and we have good numbers on homicides. So the homicide numbers, nobody in the business, criminologists really dispute. There's not extra mysterious bodies laying around. So we know what this is. If you look at those 12, you'll have suspect trying to run a police officer over with a car to kill him. You'll have a large male suspect trying to beat a female police officer to death in the face with a radio. You'll have a giant knife that was found on the seat of the car. So unarmed does not mean not deadly. And then you have situations like in Ferguson, where Michael Brown, we know now from a dozen Black witnesses and from the forensic evidence, tried to take Officer Darren Wilson's gun, and it went off in the car and was shot as a consequence. So even though the suspect might be unarmed, there's always a gun on the scene because it's the officers. And if they all of a sudden start wrestling for it, we've now entered a situation where deadly force is warranted. Or if they're trying to run you over with a car, if they're trying to hit you in the head with a pipe, okay? So you have these situations where I think it'd be very clear that the officer did what they had to do to survive. And we wouldn't want to live in a world where officers were not allowed to do that, because nobody would do this job and homicides would skyrocket even more than
Well,
they
and
are now.
And fewer cops are entering the field because they are kind of
Mhm.
scrutinized. Yeah.
So what happens when we eliminate those from the data? Well, you have one or two. You have one or two cases a year. And out of those one or two unarmed black suspects or cases a year where that situation comes up in a world where we have 300 and some odd 100 million encounters with police, they're usually prosecuted, which is exactly what should happen. So if we look at what happened in Tennessee, all 5 were fired, and now they're being prosecuted for second-degree murder, including another one I think they announced today. In fact, I have the actual number here. I can go to it. Yeah, police shot and killed 54 unarmed people in 2019, of which 12 were black. And if you eliminate everyone that was trying to kill the officer at that time, many of who had weapons in their hands, you're left with 2. And this is out of all the contacts police officers have every year with all these suspects. So is it bad? Well, none of us want to see something like that happen. And when it does happen, we want to see them prosecuted. But no, American police officers do an amazing, fantastic job in what is the least racist country on earth. And so now what we've done, what has happened is they've taken reforms from a moral panic, there's no other way to describe it, about these situations. And everything that they've done has made it worse, with the net result being thousands more dead black lives as a consequence. Here in Portland, what they did was they eliminated the gang violence response team. That was one of the first things they did. And gang shootings skyrocketed, tripled, by the way. And most of the victims were black. Those are dead black Americans that would be alive had that not happened. Many of the departments, like New York City, I think they cut the budget by $1 billion. And the first thing they did was they got rid of the plainclothes department. And the plainclothes department were the people that really dealt with the kind of street crime where these kind of shootings take place. And what's happening in New York? Violent street crime has exploded. Most of the victims are also black. So every single thing they've done has made policing worse. As you mentioned, it's harder to get good candidates now. So you're going to have more situations like we saw in Tennessee, because they're less qualified. They're not the kind of officers that we'd want to have on the streets. They have
Yeah.
less training, because the first thing that happens when you start to cut the budgets is training goes. And even if you do have training, when your budget's cut as much as it is here in Portland, so they have so few officers in Portland, they can't rotate an officer to get training in, because they need every person on the street all the time, because these guys are going from 911 call to 911 call, and the response time on a violent assault or rape could be an hour to 90 minutes. That's where we're at. So every single thing BLM and these progressive protesters have done, which is irrational based on the actual numbers, when you talk to them, they have no idea what those numbers are, has made it worse, and has resulted in a lot more dead bodies. And so at some point, we're going to have an honest conversation about that. And I am afraid that's not going to happen. And when I look at CNN, and I look at NPR, and I look at the Washington Post, and I look at the New York Times, and I look how they're playing the same game over and over again, I just don't see any hope for that.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly misperception of the facts. You just kind of breaking down this data. I think very few people can sort of quote and say what those numbers are. There is a perception that these numbers, these figures are much higher, significantly higher, and people are making their decisions based on these false data. It sounds like,
Mm-hmm. But
ultimately.
it's not hard to find that data. It's not hard to look it up. I saw a tweet from
No.
Whoopi Goldberg a couple hours ago where she was saying, is this going to happen to white people before any changes are made? And I'm like, it take you 3.5 minutes to look at the data on that and realize it happens a lot more to white people. There's a case called Tony Timpa, which was far worse than the George Floyd case, that I don't think anybody's ever heard of, where they held him down and were making fun of him and
Yeah.
kept him on his belly, and he eventually died. And I don't think she knows anything about that. But it would
It's
take
not
her
covered.
literally 2 or 3 minutes to go online and look up the data and
Mm.
say, is that actually true? But instead, she's taking as gospel what she sees on CNN or whatever media source she's taking in, and she believes that's an accurate representation of the numerical reality of what happens in the country. And that's a huge mistake, because it's not. And so I think we have to fix our media. I think we have to hold the media accountable. I think we have to have people who are willing to be honest about this. But as far as I see right now, I think everything's getting worse. Nobody wants the job anymore. Every experienced officer who was anywhere close to retirement has retired. So
Yeah.
there's a lot less experienced officers on the street. And what I saw in that Tennessee situation looked like a gang beating, and
Yeah.
that wasn't law enforcement. And it wouldn't surprise me if there's some gang affiliations there, because that's happened before in Rampart. That happened as well in Oakland. Anytime you start to lower the standards because you can't get enough candidates to apply, or you start focusing on immutable characteristics as opposed to the quality of the candidate, like someone's skin color, then you run the risk of getting people into the department that shouldn't necessarily be into the department. And we're going to see more of these kind of abusive situations, not less.
So let's take a somewhat different situation, but has some similarities in terms of how people might perceive it. So, in China, we have seen the oppression of the people by the government, in terms of harsh COVID lockdowns, policies, lockdowns, quarantine camps. But, it seems like the last straw for them was the deadly fire that had people trapped in the buildings. And then the COVID policies that they were blamed for those deaths. And it ignited mass protests. And then also we had especially at the iPhone factory, there were a lot of it did turn more violent.
Mm-hmm.
In that situation, what are your thoughts on that? Like, because the people were certainly kind of revolting, standing up to the government. I mean, we also have a situation now in Iran where the government is tyrannical against the women, have human rights violations. It might turn the government is currently being violent against the people, but at a certain point, the people might feel like, well, we've had enough. We might have to take arms and be violent against the government in order to overthrow it. At certain points, violence might be necessary, right? Like, what are your thoughts there? At what point do we decide that that is an acceptable tool for change? I guess is my question.
Yeah. Well, I think that those are very different situations from American police officers. And I think in each one of those cases, there are some very clear, very obvious, very common sense, very humane policy demands that could be made on the government. Um, very, no, you're not allowed to bolt people into buildings when COVID happens and not allow them to leave. That just can't happen, right? That's a very clear policy decision that we can make sure doesn't happen. There's things that have happened in Australia that have been horrendous.
Yeah.
And you can say, no, we're not going to allow this. And that's when the electorate has to stand up. The police aren't responsible for passing legislation. We would like to see the ones who run into unconstitutional laws like this, we would like to see all of them resign. And I think if we had police being ordered to do the kinds of things that are happening in China and even Australia, I think you would see a lot of American police officers resign because I don't think they would stand up for that. But there are very clear policy decisions that are logical that we can then talk about, and we can say, this is what we're fighting for, this is a cause worth fighting for, and this is what we want to have happen. But you don't hear that here in America when it comes to the BLM protests and the police protests. They have no ideas. They talk about abolishing the police and then what? Replacing it with what? What is your next step? Robert Reich today, who's not a dumb man, right? The economic advisor for Clinton, posted 8 names of people who have been killed during traffic stops, some of which were justified, obviously, because their traffic stops can be very dangerous and sometimes police have to use lethal force, but 8 names total. And his conclusion was, we need to stop allowing police to perform traffic stops. That was a total tweet. And I'm thinking to myself, what do you think is going to happen when police stopped doing traffic stops. Here in Portland, they don't have the manpower to do traffic stops anymore. So traffic enforcement has basically ceased in 2021. It's almost non-existent. And guess what happened? We had the highest recorded record of automobile fatalities in the city of Portland in our history. People are
Wow.
dying. And most of them, a good percentage of them, are homeless because we let the homeless live on ramps to the freeway and they get run over all the time, all of which is insane. And even if we're not talking about just automobile accidents, which will skyrocket when everybody all of a sudden realizes they no longer have to worry about getting pulled over or even bother to get insurance anymore, the next thing that's going to happen is there's going to be no proactive policing, meaning that the police in places like Chicago and Portland and Baltimore and St. Louis, who go out of their way to try and do traffic stops on known gang members that they think might be involved in, for example, a drive-by shooting, and they want to catch them with drugs and weapons in their cars so that they can prevent that shooting. That's no longer going to happen. And then you're going to have those shootings skyrocket. And a lot of the people that are going to die are going to be innocent bystanders because those guys suck with their weapons. And you're going to have babies and children shot in their car, just like we have every weekend in Chicago over what? 8 people that got shot from police over the last year. Is that Robert Reich's idea? Can he be that stupid? Like, he's not a dumb man, but that is an inane idea, and he has no solution beyond that. And my point is, why are we paying attention to people like that on this issue? That makes no sense. If you want to actually apply some intelligent reform to how we do traffic stops, let's talk about that. But going out tomorrow and preventing the police from doing traffic stops is going to result in thousands more people dying. And you're not going to be able to get some unarmed peace force to do traffic stops. I mean, you can give it a shot, but the reason why we have armed police officers do traffic stops is because it's one of the most dangerous things in law enforcement. You pull over a felon who doesn't want to go to jail, and they're going to shoot you. What recourse do you have if the person just decides that tells you to fuck off or wants to drive off? What are you going to do? Then call the police? So there's so little thought, so little intelligence put into it that I feel like it's just an emotional reaction. But even that doesn't make sense to me. So I've reached a point, and I've been thinking about this in the last few days, where the only thing that makes sense to me about some of these stupid ideas that I see some of these people espouse is that it's actually, an evolutionary explanation revolving around conspicuous convictions, right? Where they're signaling their wealth and their membership in the ruling class by coming up with these, pretending to be for these ideas that at the end of the day probably won't affect them much because they don't live in the neighborhoods where this kind of stuff happens. It's like a male peacock who all of a sudden decides to put on bright feathers. You know what I mean? And maybe I'm
Maybe.
wrong, maybe, but I can't think of another reason because Reich is not stupid. And all of a sudden
Yeah.
deciding that you no longer want police to make traffic stops is a stupid idea. Like,
Yeah,
where did it come
but
from?
smart people often have stupid ideas. Like
This is true.
it's right. It's hard
This
to
is true.
explain. Yeah,
It
they
is hard to
fall
explain.
for the stupidest scams, and you can have the stupidest. Yeah, I don't understand some of this. And I think sometimes people have this desire to feel guilt for things that they are not guilty of.
Yep.
And so they do things as a result of that. They're very easily manipulated by
Mm-hmm.
certain players.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and it's hard to, and I think people's critical thinking skills, I mean, they're so full of conviction. People are so full of conviction, whatever their side is, whatever their ideas are, that they look at everything through that one lens, and they're just incapable of sort of challenging that perspective. So they don't ask the questions, and they're very basic questions oftentimes. And so they've sort of convinced themselves of this one thing, and they just don't question it. So
Right.
they repeat. I mean, oftentimes, how often do you hear certain slogans, right? Like, uh, all lives matter, or,
Hmm.
safe and effective, whatever that happens to be. It doesn't really
Right.
matter what it is. It's repeated oftentimes that that whoever's repeating it hasn't really thought it through.
Right.
So it's just something about the state of humanity that causes that. And I think with the media too, I mean, I know that people have this tendency to think that a lot of this is sinister and then there's some strings being pulled, but a lot of these people are convinced that this is the truth and they are just as blind to it. I mean, maybe in some cases there's somebody, at the top who has some agenda. I mean, maybe, I don't know, but I haven't been at the very top of it. But the journalists themselves who do the reporting, I mean, they're often, I do think they genuinely believe a lot of this stuff
I
and they
agree with
fail to
you,
look at
and
it.
I agree with you for sure. And I'm definitely, inclined to apply, what is it, Heinlein's razor of, never assume nefarious motives when it just could be stupidity, or for sure. But the flip side of that, where I wind up having to ask myself, is how long does it really take to do the research? It takes less, for example, with the Whoopi Goldberg quote. It would
Yeah.
literally take her less than 5 minutes of research to look up a website and see how often those kind of reported events happen to white people.
She's not
That's all it would take.
interested.
Yeah,
She's not interested.
she's not
That's the
interested.
thing. But that's the thing. When you've bought into a particular narrative that is part of your identity, you're just
Hmm.
not interested. So
Hmm.
it's not just that they believe it, it's that they've arrived at a place where they're so involved that that narrative is so part of their identity that why would they look for evidence that might contradict it when it's going to hurt them, because
Right.
that by finding something that contradicts it, then they have to maybe correct it or write something else, and that would take them out of the in group. And taking them out of the in group, that's a painful thing. I mean, I've learned that how painful that can be.
Hmm.
um it's much easier when you can agree. It's just so much, it's less grief. So why pursue the truth when the lie is easier? And I mean, you don't know it's a lie at that point, right? If you don't look up the facts, you don't know that you're lying when you're saying it. So I think a lot of it is that. I mean, when I talk to a lot of these people, um, I mean, since that was my circle, kind of still is in some ways, I haven't found that there was some maliciousness there. I found that people genuinely believed it and they would get very emotional about it because it's those beliefs when they were being contradicted. I guess they didn't have enough. They weren't confident enough in those beliefs. I think that's when people get emotional. When you're not
Yes.
confident enough in your belief, then you can't defend it in a logical way. So you get emotional about it. And I
Hmm.
think that's where that like emotional defensiveness comes in. And and we can't, really, I mean, I'm I just want to know the truth.
Me too.
That's why I'm not so attached. I've never had a problem with changing my mind because I just was never attached to a particular position. And that's why I found myself where I found myself, is because it just didn't matter to me. I'm more interested in the truth, versus like a particular side, and it can come from anywhere. But I guess most people aren't really wired in that way, and it's difficult to understand why they're not. I have a
Hmm.
hard time understanding it, but I understand that that's the case.
Yeah.
And until they're able to sort of look and at themselves and be like, yeah, I'm ready to just look for the truth wherever it is, it's not going to change. um so it's kind of a sad state, I guess, as you and Peter have done. I think the NPR, the show, All Things Reconsidered, I think that's a very revealing state, and I think we can attach it to a lot of media organizations, what you were sort of uncovering in that show.
It's also so lazy. It's just so lazy. Like, how do you don't really understand an issue if you can't explain the other side, right?
No, but the reason I like, I've always sort of want somebody to argue with me, whatever my
Mhm.
position is. I
Yeah.
want somebody to present me with a counter argument because I want to be sure in my position. For me
Right.
to have certainty, I need someone really smart, like preferably the smartest person I can get, to poke holes. And if they can't find holes, then I'm more certain. So they're doing me a service. It's kind of how I view it, but people don't view it that way, and they get mad. And I've been in a lot of conversation as of late that are sort of public conversations, in Twitter Spaces and things like that, and people get very angry at me because I'll ask questions and I'll poke holes, and they see that as an attack on their side. And so I'll get very angry messages and a lot of hate mail, and I'm not aggressive about it. I'm pretty flexible, but they see it. Sometimes I'm not even disagreeing with them. I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah.
But people get so angry, and it's if we can't move past that, then we can't get to a point of sort of a calm pursuit of truth. And we have this radicalized place that we're living in where everybody's just here. If you don't agree with me, you're my enemy. And I think
Hmm.
that's why we have this kind of insane polarization. And I don't know how. I see it as very dangerous. I mean, and actually I do see it, kind of back to the topic of violence. I see it as this powder keg in some ways of violence. And when we're kind of looking, I mean, we've had the left sort of dominate so much in terms of having the power of the institutions, and you have the right, which feels like they've been betrayed, unheard, ignored. They're very resentful, and I am, based on what I'm hearing, there is this feeling of like, if this is going to continue, there is so much seething anger that there is a fraction, and I don't know how big this fraction is, that feels like, hey, there is a tool available to us, and that tool is violence. And so
Yeah.
when people get desperate, when conversation breaks, I think people do start thinking in these terms, of these violent terms, and you see the conversation is broken.
How much of this do you think came from academia?
I know that certain people think it's, and I haven't been part of academia in the same way. So I don't think academia has contributed as much as some people do. I know that some of these ideas have bred in academia,
Hmm.
but I think media was probably a bigger contributor than academia,
Hmm.
because media affects everybody.
Hmm.
Because media and culture, so like films, television. So I would see that as a bigger component, because it just trickles down a lot more.
Hmm.
Um, and that if it's not representing diversity of points of views, then people feel like they're left out of the conversation, unheard, vilified, because they're
Yeah.
often vilified, right?
Yeah.
That does not feel good. So I think academia, while I understand that some of these kind of ideas came out of it, I don't think it affects it quite as much as media and culture.
Yeah.
What
I
do you
just
think?
wonder because I think that's right, but I also wonder because you have a lot of young people that graduate from academia who these days never hear the opposing point of view because it gets labeled automatically as violence or it gets shut down. And how many of them graduate from universities, maybe even with graduate degrees, without ever even hearing the arguments from the other side?
Actually, I mean, I think that's a great point of view, point that you're making, because I hadn't thought of that, because they are graduating from these.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I know that when I went to school, certainly my campus was left leaning, and but I would jokingly say, "Oh, I'm a libertarian," just to provoke people, and
Hmm.
wasn't really, um, but it wasn't like, it didn't put me in any danger. It was just kind of provocative.
Hmm.
And but it was okay. You could argue with people, you can discuss things. It was fine. And many, like, freedom of speech was a very left wing idea, and we fought for it. And that was totally something that was supported. And now it's
Yep.
suddenly this like right wing thing, and I just don't
Yep.
get it.
I don't either.
And yeah. And so I was looking at some of the statistics, for what students support violence for shutting down speech, right? And the numbers were, I wish I had that in front of me, but the numbers were just really astoundingly high for the support for shutting down speakers for speech they didn't agree with, even supporting people in other countries, killing people for certain speech. So I found that just shocking and so dangerous.
Yep.
And so I think, yeah, because if you're not able to hear, now I've talked to some people who are students, and just to get a sense of what it's like. There's an undercurrent. I think a lot of people keep their thoughts to themselves, so it's not that they don't share different perspectives, but they've learned to sort of keep it quiet. They frame their papers a certain way. I think professors are certainly afraid of saying certain things because they're afraid the students have a tremendous power to sort of get rid of professors they don't like. And I've spoken to a lot of professors who have been, even with tenure, you think that tenure would protect you, but it doesn't protect you from harassment and
No.
and investigations and so on and so forth. So certainly you're right, like with the younger people kind of coming out of university, yeah, they are coming and they have a different culture. So that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is frustrating.
It is.
And I don't I don't know. I mean, the answer to that, the only answer I can think of that is right now is more speech and more, encouraging people to speak if more
Hmm.
freely, and creating communities that protect them, to support people when they do engage in free speech, and not have them feel like they're alone, because
Yep.
I think a lot of times people feel extremely alone. I mean,
Hmm.
I've had the experience of this kind of brush with cancellation culture, and I felt tremendously alone. But I also uh, ended up with a group of people who reached out to me. I've also had a group of people who shared their own stories with me, and that kind of is what gave me the power or the strength to be more outspoken, because I wasn't before. I was tremendously afraid. So that completely changed my life, because I felt like, hey, I found kind of the strength to be able to use my voice that I didn't have before.
Hmm.
And so I'm hoping that more people do that. And I think more people are doing that. And I think they're
Hmm.
finding sort of solace in each other, and more of a community. So the more people do that, I think the more we're going to see sort of a counter movement to it. But I'm also hoping that it doesn't come as, because what I'm also seeing is I'm seeing so much anger, and I'm seeing so much of an unhealthy counter reaction to it, where people are kind of going to the dark side. They're becoming, maybe not necessarily violent, but kind of violent with their words. And I hate to say it, not in the way that words are violence, but in the way that um, they're hostile.
Hmm.
They push back. Even this kind of idea of wokeism, right? That everything woke is bad. I mean, I'm not a fan, but 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 I also believe in giving people a chance and having conversations and seeing where they're coming from before kind of condemning, because we don't know what people are thinking
Hmm.
until we talk to them. So I take a bit of a different approach than some other people do. And I think it's very easy to have a negative experience and be pushed to an extreme.
Yep.
So I think it's important for us to sort of be aware of that, even as we have, maybe a very bad experience. I mean, I don't think you've had that, but a lot of people who are more outspoken have. So
I probably will after the book comes out, but we'll see.
do you think? I don't think the book is very well. We'll see, but I don't think. I think the book. I think the more nuanced something is. I think also when I started speaking more publicly, I started doing a lot of interviews, and I got invited to do podcasts, and I thought, oh man, I'm going to get into so much trouble with some of this stuff. But what I realized, like none of the people who really hate you are going to bother sitting through like a long podcast and listen to you. And if they do, great.
Okay, good.
Hopefully they do that, but I don't
Yeah,
think they do, and I wish they had. Well, I guess one last question, I guess, for you is
sure.
how do you know when to use violence and when to best avoid it? Is how do you decide on that?
Yeah, I think violence is best avoided, whenever possible. And the key to being able to avoid it is to manage distance from it. You can manage distance from it the sooner you're aware of it, the sooner you notice it. So the sooner you notice it, the more you can just create space away from it. We didn't talk about this at all a little bit, but I did talk a bit in the beginning of my book about what I call character disordered people, because what a lot of people don't realize is the vast majority of violence is committed by people you know. And what I
Yeah.
found when I read a lot of the self-defense literature is most of it was geared towards the stranger that attacks you. You're the violent criminal actor who attacks you when you're in the parking lot, or the rapist who attacks a woman when she's walking down the street. And that's important, and I address that as well. But statistically, the vast majority is people that you know, people that you let in your home, sometimes even people who are related to you, acquaintances. 50% of all the women in this country who are murdered by their significant other. And in almost every one of those cases, it's preceded by a lot of stalking and other incidents that lead up finally to that final violent moment. So I wanted to give people the accurate information on that and tools to be able to recognize those people. I call them character disorder because I want people to remember that someone who repeats a mistake, a repeated error, isn't a mistake, it's a character flaw. And when you have people like that in your life, sometimes you just need to create that separation. And again, we're talking about space, separation between you and the threat. So all of that's the most important thing. But when violence becomes inevitable, or when you think it's inevitable, then it becomes necessary. And when it's necessary, when it truly is necessary, it's the only thing that's going to work, right? In a situation where violence is truly necessary, nothing else is going to work but violence. And at that point, then it needs to be executed. And sometimes it's good to hit first. I don't lie about that in the book either. If I'm in a situation where I think an altercation is imminent, and for sure, then there's been more than a few situations where I've initiated the first response. So the first thing you want to do is call those people out of your life, those character disordered people, and get them out of your life and create healthy boundaries between you and those people. And then the next thing you want to be able to do, and that, by the way, once you do that, that just like puts you in a whole different category as far as ever becoming a victim. And then you're left with dealing with the strangers, and you want to be able to notice them and listen to your own instincts when you see them and be able to make space and not have to engage. But if engagement becomes necessary, when you feel it is necessary, when you feel it's about to happen, when you feel it is upon you, and that's what is real fear. It's not worry. It's not worry. It's not real paranoia. Real fear is the body's biological reaction to a threat that is in front of you at that moment. And you will know, and that fear too is a gift. That's a gift from our ancestors. And when you feel that real fear because the threat is immediate and in front of you, then sometimes violence becomes the necessary tool to use. And that's where the combat sports can come in healthy. And the violence And this case might just be enough violence for you to break contact and again create space, right? You don't need to sit there and destroy the threat. You do what you have to do. But so last resort, used only when you have to, but when you have to, it will be the only thing that's going to work. And I think it's better to be prepared to do that before you find yourself needing to do it. And that's why it's good to train in it. I talk about my rules for training my children too, and my daughters, and teaching my kids to become comfortable with conflict. To be aware of their surroundings, to be able to understand their boundaries and what's okay and what's not okay, and the fact that nobody has a right to touch you if you don't want them to. And then being comfortable just being engaged in conflict, verbal conflict, being very upfront and about your boundaries, physical conflict if necessary. Conflict is an art. And so teaching people to become comfortable in conflict and engaging in conflict before all of a sudden conflict is thrusted upon you is the smart way to do it. And going back to what we talked about before with all those evolutionary instincts and your millions of years of successful ancestors that you've had, I feel very strongly that when violence truly is necessary, you will know. You will know, and all your instincts inside will be telling you that it's necessary. And all I would ask of you at that moment is to listen to them.
That's good advice. And also on the conflict side, because I think we tend to, well, I know I tend to avoid conflict. And and sometimes when you avoid conflict, as I've learned the hard way, you actually end up with much greater conflict at
Mm-hmm.
the end
Mm-hmm.
than if you would have addressed the conflict in the first place.
100%.
So,
Comfortable
yeah.
with conflict. Very
Yeah,
important.
I am learning. I actually, when I had as I was supervising some people and had a conflict with I guess an employee, and after I didn't manage it as well as I could have. Afterwards, I had some meetings with a few people I trusted and for advice, and I said, listen, this is what happened. Can you give me some advice on how I could have dealt with this better? And
Mm-hmm.
so that if this comes up again, I could deal with this in
Mm-hmm.
a way that would have. And the biggest thing was, as soon as it came up, I should have dealt with it instead
Mm-hmm.
of trying to hope that it would go away. So avoiding conflict is going to just bring more conflict.
Yeah, it's natural, but not necessarily the right thing to do. And it's something that you can role play. I role play that with my kids all the time. Something
Yeah.
you can learn. You can just, it's like, I don't want to tell people not to talk to strangers. And in fact, the opposite, I want to tell people, get really good at talking to strangers. And that's something you can practice too by engaging in non-threatening situations, like talking to the coffee person or, just the everyday people in your life, just getting really good at that kind of banter.
Yeah.
That too will help you when it becomes time for conflict, because sometimes when a situation is stressful and you're in a situation of conflict, being able to communicate can become difficult. And the better you develop those communication skills, the better you'll be able to handle that as well.
For sure. Well, your book is actually extremely extensive. So, and I know it took a lot to write it. So, in doing the research and writing it, did you have any epiphanies? Anything that you've sort of had kind of an aha moment or anything like that?
Oh, I had a bunch. I had a bunch of them. I think the biggest thing I learned I learned all kinds of things about violence, but the biggest thing I think I learned in terms of writing fiction, nonfiction, is it's very difficult to create the structure. Structuring nonfiction and writing for me, I think, comes very easily, but then being able to organize it, know which goes first, and how to create and tell a story when you're dealing with nonfiction because you don't have a plot is an interesting challenge. So, and I hope I've gotten a little bit better at that. I'm really interested in that idea, and in a way, organizing my thoughts for the book and organizing my thoughts for writing also helps you just organize your own thoughts in your own head, to be able to think more clearly. So Hopefully the book sells well, and if it does, I've already written the second one because this is 600 and some odd pages, but I wound up writing like 2,500 pages. So that's the 600 that got edited back, and all the actual physical training, because there was sections on stand-up clinching, ground, and weapons, were omitted from the book, and will probably be, if I write a second book, it'll be the second book where we're actually talking about training for the gift. And so hopefully this one will sell, and I look forward to writing the second.
Well, it sounds great. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I had a great time having this conversation with you
Thank you.
and really appreciate your time.
I appreciate yours. Thanks for having me on.